This show is part of the Proclaim Podcast Network, thoughtfully crafted, faithfully told stories that proclaim His name. More at proclaim.fm.
So I went in for the polygraph, and I was having trouble with some of the questions. And I realized very quickly that I was going to fail this test, not only if I was lying, but just if I felt guilty about anything. And just kind of the more I was there, the more I started thinking, trying to clear my conscience by just thinking of everything that I'd done wrong. All of a sudden, that list grew really long.
Hey, I'm Jacqueline Stoner from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I'm a Christian life coach and writer. I love listening to Compelled because the interviews are always genuine. They encourage me in my own spiritual walk, especially during these days of upheaval around the world. I frequently forward the podcast to friends because the testimonies are so powerful. It's wonderful to hear God work. Please enjoy today's episode.
I'm Paul Hastings, and you're listening to Compelled, where we use gripping, immersive storytelling to bring to life Christian testimonies from the kingdom of God, told by the people compelled to live for Him. If you've been enjoying Compelled for some time now, then please make sure to listen to the end of today's episode. We've got some exciting announcements that we want to make sure you hear. Recently, we heard from Mary Ann Sanford, who grew up surrounded by cults and drugs, yet tried to make her own way through life and felt that she was a good person. But she didn't realize how far from the mark she truly was, or how close God had been every step of the way. Again, you can hear that story in episode number 97 with Mary Ann Sanford. Today, our guest is Tom Rudelius. Tom was a top student at an Ivy League school and had never given much thought to God. Maybe He existed or maybe not, but there probably wasn't any real way to tell. But then one day, Tom began looking for proof and ended up finding faith. So gather around, lean in, and join us for another compelling story from the kingdom of God. Tom and I met up one summer day in California near Los Angeles, and he began telling me his story. Tom and his twin brother Steve grew up all over the world due to their dad's work, including England, Japan, and of course the US. They both loved playing sports and were academically gifted, and for the most part, their home life was pretty stable.
I grew up in a very loving, but also a very non-religious family, along with my twin brother, Steve. So growing up, never went to church, never read the Bible. And most of what Steve and I knew about religion came from cartoons. We went to church just a handful of times in our entire childhood, right? Not a handful of times per year, but like a handful of times total. We went to my grandparents' church in Minnesota, and I kind of just remember it being kind of boring, right? I mean, I wasn't totally against religion. I wasn't completely opposed. I didn't think it was like this terrible menace to society. But it just seemed like something that wasn't really that important to me. That I always figured I'm basically a good person. If there's a heaven, I'll probably go to it. And so why does it matter what exactly I believe, right? Why does that matter? In the end, I'm just kind of hoping that there's heaven out there, right? Hoping that I don't just cease to exist when I die. It's kind of like the point of religion is to help people be more moral. And I always felt that I had plenty of moral guidance from my parents, from my teachers. And so religion just didn't seem like the most important thing to me. I did pray sometimes. I have this very clear memory of one time before I had an indoor soccer game, my leg was like a little injured, and I prayed that it would get better in time for me to play in the game. And it did, actually. It worked. But I certainly didn't attribute that to any sort of supernatural intervention. I could always imagine that there's some sort of higher purpose behind everything that exists, that, that there could be some sort of higher intelligence or something like that. So back then, I guess the whole idea of God just seemed very mysterious to me. I wasn't totally sure that God didn't exist. I wasn't sure that God did exist. It just seemed like a mystery, and a mystery that wasn't really that important to me.
Like an agnostic, basically. No, so not a hardcore atheist.
Yeah. Agnostic, apatheist. I don't know if I just made up that word, but I feel like that would be the better word, right? It's not like I've thought hard about this and come to the conclusion that I don't know. It's just like, man, the whole topic seems so far off from where I am. And, I have a good moral system. I have things that I care about and people I care about. And it's like, I have a lot of good things. So surely the purpose of life must be found in the things kind of that I already have, in the arenas that are already important to me. I guess it was pretty much like that going off to college, where I had just other things that were on my mind that were more important, like school and sports, and trying to make the most of my time there. My twin brother, Steve, who had mentioned, of the two of us, he was probably even a little bit more antagonistic towards religion. I remember when we were looking at schools, which schools to go to, the idea of going to any school with a religious affiliation just seemed like really silly to him. So he went to Northwestern University just outside of Chicago, and I went to Cornell University in upstate New York. So I was really surprised when then one day, freshman year of college, he told me that he'd decided to become a Christian. He'd been talking with some guys from his dorm, and one of them was a Christian, and they had a lot of conversations about faith. And so after 8 or 9 months of talking, Steve had decided to become a Christian. It was pretty much out of the blue, right? I really didn't expect of either of us, it would be him, but I really didn't expect either of us to embrace religious faith. I can't remember exactly what the conversation was like or what he said, but what I can remember is how I felt, which to me, it almost felt like a bit of a betrayal. As I said, I wasn't totally opposed to religion, but it was something that just neither of us had ever been a part of, it hadn't been a part of either of our lives. And I really liked my twin brother, right? Like, I liked the things that we shared of school and sports and cartoons and video games and just normal stuff like that. And so I was worried that by coming to faith, by becoming a religious person, that my brother was just going to become somebody totally different. And so that was really my worry, was that I was going to lose him as a brother and as a best friend. And so, I just wasn't sure what to expect. And so that was maybe the moment that really set the stage for the journey that I was about to go on. The summer after our freshman year of college, he got baptized in Lake Michigan, in Evanston, where he went to college. So he invited me, and our mom and I drove down from Minnesota, where I was for the summer, and so I was at his baptism. That was first time being with him since he had come to faith, and also first time experiencing a little bit of what Christianity looked like, going to church with him, going to his baptism. He went to a more modern church that had rock music, and that was a big change after having gone to my grandparents' old church. And my grandparents' church, they were probably the average age of the person there, right? So it's very old, traditional. And so it was quite a surprise coming to the church service with my brother. And especially, I think maybe what was even more surprising than the music and the style was just seeing all those young people there. Because to me, religion did kind of fall into this category of outdated things. And it's oh wow, all these people, faith to them isn't just something that our ancestors used to do. This is something that obviously they're passionate about. They're up with their hands raised while they're worshiping and stuff. And yeah, it was a surprising experience. It was also surprising, I think, being with Steve and his Christian friends. So I remember after his baptism, Steve was just hanging around with his friends, and they were just making jokes about this imaginary book of the Bible that they would reference kind of in support of whatever they wanted. And I remember one of them saying something after Steve's baptism, sorry, Steve, your baptism doesn't count unless you chug root beer afterwards. And so it's okay, these are super nerdy, Christian nerds, right? Joking, not even about chugging a beer, but about chugging a root beer. But at the same time, I was also just pleasantly surprised that they were not like as judgmental maybe as I feared. That was definitely another impression that I had of religious people is, that they're all judgmental. And so I think it was just a bit of a surprise to see all these young people who were kind of nerdy, but also kind of like fun, lighthearted, and nice people who took an interest in me and obviously had taken an interest in Steve and had welcomed him into their community. So it was kind of like starting to have some of the preconceived notions of Christianity that I'd grown up with challenged that weekend. So after Steve's baptism, he came back to Minnesota. That's where my mom lived. And so that's where Steve and I spent the summer. And so that was a really pivotal summer because Steve had just come to faith. And as I said, I wasn't sure, has he become a totally different person? And one thing I found definitely was that Steve, his love for me hadn't changed. He still loved me. He still loved playing sports and throwing a baseball and throwing a football and all that stuff. But I also got to see how his convictions had changed. And so pretty early on, he started asking me what I believed. And I realized that I actually just wasn't even really sure what I believed. That a lot of these questions I hadn't spent too much time thinking about. I certainly didn't know too much about the topic. But essentially, he wanted to try to convert me too, right? He tried to give me a copy of the Bible, or specifically the New Testament, and some other books about Christianity to read. And I told him, look, Steve, I have trouble finding time to read books that I want to read, much less time to read books that I don't want to read. That's just where I was. Remember, like, religion just doesn't seem like the most important thing to me. There are other books that I'd rather be reading, right, than the Bible. But I remember clearly there was one day where I asked Steve, like, hey, what do you want to do? Remember, this is like before smartphones, when people got bored sometimes. And so I asked him, what do you want to do? And so Steve, usually when I asked him, what do you want to do? He would say, go, throw a football or go play some video games or go watch some TV or something. But he said, let's do a Bible study. And I said, that seems kind of boring. Like, can we do something else? And we did. I think we went and we probably threw a baseball or something. But then, I thought about it for a few hours and I thought just about all the times that Steve had done things for me, just out of the goodness of his heart, even things that he didn't want to do. I was starting to maybe like go on this journey, trying to figure out what is this faith, this religion that, that he's become convinced of and that he's so convicted about. So kind of curiosity to see what this is all about. And so after a couple hours, I went up to him and I said, hey, Steve, do you still want to do that Bible study? And so we did. And so we read through the first chapter of the Gospel of John together. It was the first time I remember doing like a Bible study. It was my first Bible study. I can't remember exactly how I went from like, I don't want to read the Bible, that seems boring. But I think it was mainly just like Steve's love for me, just kind of his persistence and just my curiosity, and wanting to be around him. I think that's why I started to go to church. It wasn't that I was so curious about what church was or, that I like wanted to connect to God. It was kind of just more like, well, Steve's going there and I kind of like want to spend time with him, So that was maybe my first glimpse of kind of like, oh, maybe there's something to this religion, maybe I've been too dismissive of it. Maybe there's something more reasonable about it than I have been led to believe. So yeah, it was kind of just that mix of all of these things, of going to church with Steve, of reading the books, eventually reading the New Testament, that gradually a lot of my preconceived notions about religion were starting to change. I always thought that the Bible and Christianity in general was boring. My own experience with church hadn't been especially exciting, but even more so, I had a lot of friends growing up whose parents made them go to church every Sunday. The thing that they always said is that, church is boring, the Bible is boring. And so that was something that when I started to read the New Testament, I quickly found that I didn't find it boring, Even if I didn't necessarily believe in it, even if I had trouble with the miracles at first, and, even if I had questions, I just thought that there was something really captivating about Jesus and something just really interesting, about this is the guy who's maybe the most important and influential person who's ever lived, And so just reading about them, there was a lot of surprises. I mean, Jesus is just he doesn't rise to power the way that most people rise to power, right? He doesn't, not with military might, but with self-sacrificial love. And so I think that there was something just, really compelling about the person of Jesus that I remember when I started reading it, I said, okay, I'm going to try to read the New Testament. I'm going to read one chapter a day. But I remember when I got near the end of some of the Gospels where I just read 3 or 4 chapters because it was actually that captivating.
Now, keep in mind, Tom was attending a top Ivy League school and triple majoring in physics, math, and statistical science. He was no academic slouch, and once he decided to research something, he wasn't going to be stopped for lack of diligence. Tom needed to know the truth.
When I first started talking with Steve, there were lots of questions. There were lots of discussions, even debates that we had where I was wrestling with questions like miracles. How do I square belief in miracles with belief in science? And, how does God let bad things happen to good people? And all these sorts of questions. There was a lot of learning there. I didn't have all the questions answered, but I had reached a point where I was basically on the fence, intellectually. And then my experience kind of pushed me over the edge. I think I finished the New Testament right around Christmas of 2009. So I was actually reading it. And it was something actually interesting. I didn't know this. At the time, I felt like, man, I'm learning a lot. I feel like my perception of Christianity is starting to change. And it was starting to seem more and more reasonable. So it was something that I definitely felt like I was on the journey. It's funny, I didn't know this until just recently, but when I asked Steve about it, he said that when we went back to college, we went our separate ways. He went to Northwestern, I went to Cornell. That from his perspective, it felt like I just wasn't interested at all. That I just given it a shot, that I'd read some of the books, but at the end of the day, I just wasn't really about it.
But in reality, that was the farthest thing from the truth. Tom was deeply grappling with the questions posed by Christianity. Was there a God? Could he be known? Was Jesus his actual son? And was Tom headed to hell unless he placed his faith in this Jesus? For 6 months, Tom continued wrestling with these questions until a breakthrough came during, of all things, a job interview, which you'll hear about right after the break. Welcome back to Compelled. Tom Rudelius was 20 years old, and after watching his twin brother become a born-again Christian 6 months previously, was now exploring matters of faith for the first time. With his brother's encouragement, Tom read through the New Testament in 6 months, and just a few weeks later, sat down for a job interview that would prove to be a pivot point in his journey to faith.
In my sophomore year, I applied for an internship with the NSA. So the NSA stands for National Security Agency. Think kind of like the CIA, right? It's one of the intelligence agencies. And the NSA, another fact about them is that they're the largest employer of PhD mathematicians. They do a lot of cryptography and stuff like that. So mathematics is at the heart of a lot of what they do, which is why they had internships for guys like me, right? I'm not about to be a secret agent, but I can kind of pretend to be one as I'm just doing math. It was contingent upon a background check and taking a polygraph test, colloquially known as a lie detector test. The goal of it is to spot deception, and it does that by measuring your heart rate, breathing rate, and your sweat rate. And so the idea is those things are correlated with deception. When someone's trying to hide something or tell a lie, that they'll respond physiologically, and so that you can measure that. And so the NSA uses the polygraph to try to screen applicants for security. They don't want to accidentally hire a Russian spy or a terrorist or something like that. So they're asking you questions like, are you a spy? Have you ever committed an act of terrorism against the United States? But then also, have you ever committed any serious crimes? Is there anything that you've done really bad that you're trying to hide from us?
And you have to answer these questions while you're hooked up to the polygraph machine.
Yeah, that's right. There are I think 7 questions. And the answer to all of them is just no, right? It's have you ever done this? Have you ever done this? Have you ever committed any serious crimes? And the answer is no, 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 no. The answer isn't the thing they're looking for, right? They're looking for how do you respond? How does your breathing and your heart rate and all these things respond when you say that you have not done any of these things?
This polygraph test that you were doing, how long did you end up being there talking to the polygrapher?
4 hours.
4 hours.
And I remember the woman who called me beforehand to say, first day you're going to have some normal interviews. Second day you have a polygraph and it's 4 hours long. And I remember thinking 4 hours? How on earth could that take 4 hours? But yeah, it took 4 hours. It took 4 hours. And most of that, maybe only a half hour total is like the actual running of the tests. The other 3.5 hours is just confession. It's just trying to clear your conscience so that you can pass the test. Yeah. So I went in for the polygraph. And this was now January during my sophomore year of college. I had just finished reading the New Testament, a few weeks before. And so I think my approach to this polygraph was actually pretty similar to my approach towards heaven. I said, I'm basically a good person. I haven't done anything seriously wrong. If there's a heaven, I'll probably go to it. And so this test is going to be fine. I'm not a terrorist. I have no intention of spying on the United States or anything like that, right? So I figured this should be fine. But I went in and they started asking me the questions, and they did it a couple times, and I was having trouble with some of the questions. And I realized very quickly that I was going to fail this test, not only if I was lying, but just if I felt guilty about anything. So a question that usually would trip me up was the serious crimes. Have you committed any serious crimes? And I don't think I have committed any serious crimes, but as soon as they asked me that question, I started thinking about all of the little crimes that I'd committed, like sneaking into high school football games without paying the $5 entrance fee and illegally downloading music on LimeWire. It's like everybody was getting music illegally on LimeWire. So it was kind of like that, where they'd ask the question and I'd think of something and then I'd confess it. And then they do the questions again and I'd think of something else and I'd confess that. And just kind of the more I was there, the more I started thinking, trying to clear my conscience by just thinking of everything that I'd done wrong. All of a sudden, that list grew really long. It was actually kind of an eye-opening experience. One thing I realized as I became really conscious of honesty and deception was I started to realize how often I just kind of tell little white lies without really thinking about it too much, or how often in the course of my life, I just try to massage the truth a little bit to make me look better. So yeah, that's something that really kind of stood out to me with all those hours of polygraphs. I remember having this argument with Steve during the summer before. Steve was arguing, that people are sinful and separated from God. And I was saying, no, I think people are basically good. Exhibit A was I feel like I'm basically a good person. And so going into this polygraph and having to answer all these questions, and then, failing, having to confess everything I've ever done wrong, all of a sudden it hit me, deep down, I'm not as good of a person as I'd like to think I am. I've done a lot of things that I'm not proud of. And all of a sudden, basically realized that Steve was right, that I'm not actually such a good person after all. And probably no one else is either, right? Probably I'm not special here. I think just about any of us, if we really had to think hard, for me, a job's on the line, if I can't get it all out of me. And I think for most of us, if we just really had to confess all the worst things we've ever done for hours and hours, we start to realize hey, I'm not actually as good of a person as I like to think I am. And that's where I guess the rest of the gospel message that Steve had told me about started to really make sense, that, the people are sinful, that we're separated from God by the things that we do wrong, and yet that God loves us and that he's sent his son, Jesus, to die in our place and to forgive us. And so realizing my own need for forgiveness was really the thing that made that whole message click. But it was really just kind of this perfect combination of that experience meeting me at just the right time, just when this message that I'd been reading about and hearing about and hearing preached at church, that all of it kind of just started to make sense to me. And Christianity basically just made the most sense out of the world, out of my own experience. And so I credit that with the day that I came to faith.
Did you eventually pass the test?
I did not, no. It was a long adventure with not just one polygraph test that day, but 4 more over the course of my saga. And at the end, I eventually did not get a security clearance. So a long time of confession in polygraph rooms. But walking out of that polygraph room, you might have thought that I would just feel terrible and ashamed of myself, right? And because not only had I failed the test, but also just man, I had to share all of these terrible things that I've ever done, But I actually felt really joyful, because I think, that was the moment that I really understood forgiveness and grace. And yeah, I just felt thankful to God, that it's man, I can share all of those terrible things and God forgives me for that. Yeah, God forgives all of that. And so I actually felt really joyful leaving it. And I just kind of had this boost of confidence, of joy for the next few days. that I would say is like the indwelling of the Holy Spirit coming to me and me just like feeling that joy of forgiveness and God's grace.
Tom truly was changed. And he later noted that much like Zacchaeus the tax collector, he felt compelled to repay his debts and set right his wrongs. He swung by the Apple store and bought an iTunes gift card and then promptly cut it up with scissors and threw the scraps into the trash to make restitution for all the times he'd illegally downloaded music. Then he went to his high school and tried to give them cash for all the times he snuck into football games without paying. He also called his mom and spoke with his dad and apologized for the ways that he had dishonored them while growing up. And while Tom realized that none of these actions excused him for the sins he committed, these were the steps of a new creation who recognized that there was a God of the universe who called on Tom to submit his life and walk in repentance.
A couple days afterwards, I sent Steve a Facebook message, which again goes to show you kind of date this whole story. Yeah, we're talking about LimeWire and Facebook messages. So I sent Steve a Facebook message and basically told him that I'd become a Christian now. And he called me up then when he got the message, and he was like overjoyed. He was like literally weeping. I was in the airport at that point. I was about to fly back from the interview back to school. And so there in the airport, he told me just how happy he was. And he asked me if I was like ready to put my faith in Jesus, was the way he phrased it. And I actually hesitated for a moment because I kind of still felt like, man, this is like a really big life change. And it's still kind of like the feeling of like, man, do I really need this? Is this really worth it? Do I really like believe all this stuff? But then there was this like other voice that was kind of like, well, if not now, then when, right? Like if this isn't it, if this isn't like God revealing himself to you, then nothing is ever going to be, right? Like if this isn't it, then what is? And so it was like, all right, I'm in. And so I said yes, and we prayed together. And so that was the first time of like praying as a Christian, you know, with my brother on the phone. And one of the main things that he encouraged me to do was to find a church and to get involved in Christian community somehow. So as I said, we'd gone to church. I'd gone to church with my brother when we were both home for the previous summer. But when I went off to school, I didn't find a church there, right? It was fun going with him, but I wasn't about to go by myself. And so he told me, you should find a church. And I was still hesitant. I mean, I still felt like an outsider in Christian spaces, didn't especially feel like I belonged. So for a long time, I just didn't do anything. And then I happened to be on an intramural basketball team with a guy who was on staff with the campus ministry. So he had like mutual friends. I didn't know him, but we had mutual friends that kind of started this team. So we were on it together. You know, he was, I think in his late 20s, early 30s. He was married. He had a couple of young kids. And he said he was just like out in his car before our last game of the season, which sadly was a loss in the playoffs. But he was just kind of like asking himself, like, man, what am I doing here? You know, is this like I have all these other things that are more important, and, you know, he's on staff with campus ministry. Like his life is really devoted to God and to his faith. And he was just kind of wondering, like, man, God, am I on this basketball team? Am I doing this for you, or am I doing it for me? And so he just like prayed that God would give him like an opportunity to somehow like talk about his faith, or to invite one of the guys on the team. And I think he was thinking about some of the other guys that he knew better than me. But, you know, after the game, I was in there thinking like, man, Steve's wanted me to get involved in campus ministry or church somehow. And this just feels like too good of an opportunity to pass out. So I went up to Nick. That was his name. I went up to Nick after the game, and I was like, hey, Nick, yes, I know you're on staff with campus ministry. I just became a Christian, and I'm like looking to get involved somehow.
This is like moments after he prayed.
Moments after he prayed, yeah. So definitely like from his side of the story, like definitely an answered prayer for him. And so I started going to his small group Bible study, and he started getting me to come to church with him. And eventually he started like meeting with me one-on-one for discipleship. And so that was like just really big. Kind of Steve, my twin brother, was like my first kind of spiritual mentor in walking me along this journey. But Nick really took it over from there and was someone who was just, there for me in college to help me teach me about all these things about faith that I didn't know and what it looked like to live out this faith that I had somehow come to believe. And also he just did a really great job of modeling it as well and like living it out with his own life. As I said, he really like took me under his wing. He started meeting with me, and being a part of Christian community for the first time was like another really big step of my spiritual journey, especially being around young people who really took their faith seriously. Like I said, growing up, the people who I knew who were involved with churches were all old people. Church just wasn't something that young people really cared about. And so having young people around who really cared, it was just kind of eye-opening to me. And it was also really important, I think, in getting me from that place of intellectually, okay, I think I believe this now, to, okay, I'm actually going to live life as a Christian. And I remember actually in Nick's small group, there was one day when one of the other students came to group and like his grandfather had just passed away. And for me, I mean, I had lost one of my grandfathers like a couple of years previously. And I remember, that was just like really, really hard. And yet like this other student, it seemed it was clearly like hard for him too, but there also was sort of this peace that he had, just knowing that his grandfather was in God's hands and that there's hope for life after death in Christ, and that God has a plan even to take a terrible thing like a death and make something good come out of it. And so that was pretty amazing for me to see, just what it looked like, the sort of faith that even a college student, who obviously, as a college student, you think you know everything, and then you realize that you have so much more to learn. But already I could see in him the way that faith made a difference in his life, and ostensibly could make a difference in mine as well. I mean, I think the community aspect was something that it really wasn't something that I thought of beforehand. A lot of my journey kind of felt like, this is just like me and God, right? We're going to be friends. I'm going to be like, God and I are going to have this relationship. And that's good. But what's even better, I think, is the fact that what I was welcomed into wasn't just a relationship with God, but also this whole community of people who are brought together by faith. So that was something that was, I guess, just like a really amazing thing to have. Some of my best friends still from that time are people that I met through Crew and through church there. And so, yeah, that was kind of like maybe the next big learning experience for me, was getting past the individual relationship with God, although that's obviously a good thing, but making it even larger, being part of this larger community of faith.
Without Tom's family of believers, his spiritual development could very likely have stagnated or been squelched, just like the seeds that landed in the rocky ground or thorny soil in Jesus' parable of the sower from Matthew 13. But in God's kindness, Tom was embedded in a vibrant group of Christians. But that didn't mean Tom would be entirely immune from doubts, which we'll hear about right after the break. Welcome back to Compelled. While Tom Rudelius was studying physics, math, and statistical science at a top-tier Ivy League school, he had finally embraced faith in Christ as the Savior of sins, and he had a wonderful Christian community to support him. In fact, Tom realized that his previous interactions with regular Christians played a huge role in laying the groundwork for his conversion.
Belonging preceded believing. I started going to church with my twin brother long before I intellectually said, I believe this, I'm a Christian. And I started, meeting with him, that sort of I had this relationship with him, that he brought me into this little community of just the two of us, where I felt like I started to feel like I belonged. There was, as you say, this intellectual side of things. But yeah, I feel like that's only half the story. And for a while, I almost felt like I wanted to like hide this fact or like apologize for it, because I'm a scientist, right? Like I'm supposed to have this like super rational view of the world that like I'm immune to other everything besides, I don't have emotions. Everything I believe is based on like pure rationality. The reality is that there's no such thing as pure rationality, right? That all of our beliefs, all of our thoughts, all of our experiences, it's all filtered through this lens of our past experience. And that's something too that, as I look back, it's not like I went from this kind of like pure rationality into embracing religion, which is what I used to think religion was. what it really was is I had my own religion, even before I became religious, right? That I had my own worldview, that I assumed that, the purpose of life is to have fun and to be a good person. And God doesn't really matter. And what I believe about God doesn't really matter. And I had this worldview, right? I had a religion, if you will, the entire time. And so just as how I never really my decision to embrace that one wasn't just pure rationality, neither was my decision to embrace what I now believe in Christianity. Neither was that pure rationality, because I just don't think that that really exists when it comes to this question. That's not to say that reason doesn't play an important role, that we can't sit down and argue about things. But at the end of the day, all the evidence in the world, two smart people can look at the same exact evidence. But there's, I think, going to be an intellectual component, but there's going to be something more than that too. And there definitely was for me.
As Tom alluded, even though he was a scientist, placing his faith in Jesus Christ was not a purely academic decision. And it really shouldn't be for anyone. After all, in Matthew 22, Christ commands us to love the Lord our God with all our hearts, souls, and minds, which Tom eagerly embraced. But that's not to say that Tom also hasn't experienced his share of self-doubts.
I mean, there's definitely been this continuing journey of growth and learning. I think one thing that has happened a few times, I've had these seasons of just really terrible, crippling doubt and fear and anxiety of, is this all really true? And do I actually believe this? Am I actually even a Christian? I was just reading this blog from a guy who was a Christian and had become an atheist. And it's not like he made any surprising points or arguments that just shattered everything I had once believed. But just having this recognition that some people's intellectual awakenings had led them away from faith instead of to faith made me worried. What if that's me? What if that's going to happen to me? And how do I know that the arguments that I believed are really the right ones, right? Are really convincing? Because obviously he was convinced by something else. So yeah, that was kind of the start of it. And when I look, something that it took me way too long to realize, but that I can now say looking back, is that really the doubt, the intellectual doubt, was a small thing. And really what I was actually just dealing with primarily was a mental health crisis, that I was just experiencing anxiety. And as a counselor that I talked to years later would say, the problem isn't my faith, the problem is the anxiety. And it just so happens that my faith is the arena that these doubts play themselves out in, right? Lots of people have anxiety, lots of people have kind of obsessive doubts. And for me, those were attacking my faith, probably just because that's something that's really important to me. But what I kind of now realize is that there's a lot of things out there for how to help with anxiety, and obsessively watching debates about the existence of God is probably not the best one. That I can try to deal with the anxiety first, and then I have permission to come back to those doubts later and come back to those questions later. And something that's been super encouraging was a mission trip to Haiti. And I think that was a super intense experience of Christian community. Since then, I've had a chance to go to a few different countries, and currently I'm on the board of an organization called the Mamelodi Initiative, started by a bunch of Cru students. It does tutoring for high school students in South Africa. And so I've had this opportunity to go to a lot of these places and to see what faith looks like there. And that's something that's encouraging to see, and to recognize too that a lot of the things that we maybe take for granted as far as what church should look like and what Christian culture should be like, starting to see that actually a lot of things can be very different in different places. And yet there's also a lot that's the same, right? Our shared faith in a God who loves and forgives and has died to give us life, that really brings so many people together, and in ways that cross cultural and racial and socioeconomic boundaries. And actually that's something I should say too, that something I've been really grateful for is, I grew up in a very affluent suburb of Washington, D.C. I've been educated in very top schools and college and then grad school and all this stuff. And so, I'm very much kind of a product of this ivory tower of academia. But something that I've been really grateful for is the way that my faith has brought me into community with a lot of people from lots of different backgrounds, both internationally, especially getting to work with, South African college students through this organization, in Haiti as well, some of the college students there, but even here in the US, some of the people that I've met, it's like I never would have run into these people except for through my faith. And so that's been something that's really, really encouraging too for me about faith, is just the diversity that it brings and the way that Jesus' gospel just breaks down so many barriers that divide us. I've had a number of, I would say, maybe like key insights, like things that really, ways that I've started to appreciate the bigness of the gospel in new ways. But I think one of them, especially when it comes to this question of doubt and fear and anxiety, is, the first time that I ran into this obsessive doubt, a big component of it was like, wait, am I really a Christian now? Like, do I really even believe this stuff? Because it feels like one day I'm like, okay, yeah, I think I believe. And then the next day it's like, oh man, like, I don't know, I just don't know what's true. And I've been really convinced and also, I guess, kind of relieved by some stuff I've read. There's a book called Salvation by Allegiance Alone by Matthew Bates. And the premise of this book, is that when the Bible calls us to faith, really like the best translation of the faith that it's calling to is really allegiance, as opposed to like intellectual belief. And I think that's a big thing because, as I say, I'm so much of what I do is thinking about intellectual questions. And I think that it's easy for me to kind of do the same with God and make God an intellectual question to answer rather than a being to love and worship and obey. And, like the book of James says, even the demons believe, right? Even the demons know intellectually that there's a God, but it doesn't lead them to submit, right? They don't give their allegiance to God. And that's kind of the difference. And so I think that that's something that has been comforting for me in those times of doubt, is coming to realize that, even if it feels like my intellectual belief is like going up and down like a roller coaster, that what God really wants from me is for me to give him my allegiance even in those doubts. Like, I may not be able to just flip a switch and turn them off at all times, but I can choose to obey him and to follow him and to give him my allegiance even in the midst of those doubts and to take his side against the doubts. So that's been, I guess, a big kind of a game changer for me. I still will have anxiety sometimes. I'll still probably have those seasons, but I don't need to worry in those seasons that God all of a sudden doesn't love me or that he's forgotten about me. I'm still called to follow him, and that's really what I can do in these moments.
As our conversation came to a close, Tom reminded us of what another intellectual, former skeptic, but eventual Christian convert once wrote.
There's a great C.S. Lewis quote, which is from Screwtape Letters. The cause of the demons is never in more peril than when a human who has lost all sight of the enemy and looks around and wonders why he has been forsaken and yet still obeys, right? That's kind of what God is really after for us in those moments. And I think for me, it's those moments look like anxious, obsessive doubts. But for other people, that could look, there's all sorts of suffering out there that we can find ourselves in. I'm sure I will have plenty more throughout the rest of my life. But the call from God is just always to continue to follow him and to obey and to trust him that he'll get everything right in the end.
I appreciate you
taking
the time and letting us come and chat and talk about your faith, brother.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me and for joining me here. And yeah, just been a lot of fun to talk about this with you. So thank you.
In some ways, Tom's story reminds me of the Apostle Paul, formerly known as Saul. He was a well-educated Roman citizen and a self-described Pharisee of Pharisees. He was highly moral and indignant about a group of upstart Christians. But on his way to Damascus to put an end to this nonsense, the Lord intervened. And then before he could begin his eventual ministry, he was pulled into Christian community by Barnabas the Encourager. Today, Tom lives with his wife Abby in Durham, England, and is a professor of theoretical physics at Durham University. He's also written his testimony in a book called Chasing Proof, Finding Faith, which we'll link to in our show notes. And just like Tom mentioned, finding Christian community is a huge part of our Christian walk. If you're not plugged in with a healthy local church of Christians that you meet with regularly, then let me encourage you to check out our Find a Church page on our website at compelledpodcast.com. There's a link at the top called Find a Church, which will direct you to some church finding tools that we've grown to trust. And while I can't speak personally about every single church listed, by and large, we trust the ministries that have compiled these lists. So in some cases, you might even see some overlap. Again, you can access that at compelledpodcast.com. Just click the Find a Church link at the top of the page or in the navigation. And if you know someone who would be encouraged by Tom's testimony, then please send this to them. It's episode number 98 with Tom Rudelius. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of today's episode that we've got several exciting announcements. And the first announcement is that we are only 2 more episodes away from releasing episode number 100. And it's hard to believe that we're here. When my wife Sarah and I first launched Compelled 7 years ago, we had no idea if people would want to listen to testimonies like these. But now, 7 years later, millions of people tune in every year to listen to the stories of what God is doing around the globe. And these stories are making an impact. Here's just a handful of messages that we've received in the last couple of months. Carrie from Texas writes that Compelled has changed and grown my faith and my understanding of who the Lord is, and consequently my love for him as I see his heart and mercy. Compelled has also challenged me to extend much more mercy and patience to others who are elsewhere in their spiritual journey, and to pray for those who seem absolutely hardened and hopeless. Another listener, Griffin, wrote in and said, "Thank you for all your work. I was trapped in an addiction to porn and felt so broken. I had all the resources to change. I went to church, did daily devotions, and tried to change my ways, but I now know that God is the only satisfier, and I am desecrating the people who are built in the image of God. Thank you, guys." And finally, listener Denise writes that it is so uplifting to hear the many ways that God touches people and changes lives. I can't tell you enough how listening to Compelled has strengthened my faith and grown my compassion. I pray that it impacts many for a long time to come and continues to grow the family of Christ. And we're just grateful to receive messages like these. They're very encouraging for us to read. And I believe these stories are encouraging not just those who've sent in messages, but everyone else who listens to these testimonies. And Sarah and I and the rest of the Compelled team are just so filled with gratitude that we get to share these stories. And as a way of celebrating our upcoming 100th testimony, we're putting together a special behind-the-scenes episode, and we'd love to have your participation. If you have been blessed by the stories on Compelled, then send us a quick 2-minute recording on your cell phone telling us how God has used Compelled to spur you in your walk with Him. You don't have to film yourself. It can be an audio recording if you want. In fact, you can even write it down and then read it out loud. There is zero pressure here. We just want to hear your story. And then we'll take a few of our favorites and incorporate them into our special 100 episode celebration. To submit your 2-minute story, just visit compelledpodcast.com/celebration and send us your message, and you might show up in our special Compelled episode. Okay, the second announcement, which is more of a teaser. There is something huge that we've been working on since last year. And it's something that Sarah and I have been talking about off and on for the last 5 years, but never really knew if it would happen. But then about a year ago, we got a surprising email, which pretty much changed everything. We've been working hard for the last year making this happen, but we've never made an announcement about it on the radio or on the podcast because we didn't know if it would fall through or not. But now we know for sure it's happening because it is happening. It is a done deal. And if you're on our Compelled Insider email list, then you've probably seen some hints. And there's going to be a whole bunch more hints and news that we're going to share on the Insider email list. If you want to be on the cusp of what is happening with Compelled and possibly even play a part in it, then make sure to join our email list. Just hop on our website, compelledpodcast.com, and you can sign up there. Otherwise, mark your calendars for July 7th. What we're going to share and launch that day is a labor of love that you don't want to miss. All right, our third announcement. Since August of last year, we've been working hard behind the scenes to remaster our older Compelled episodes. These are stories that were released 5 or 6 years ago, and we were still new to the world of podcasting and even understanding how we wanted to tell stories. And I think since then, we've gotten a lot better. And since you, our audience, allowed us to launch Compelled on national radio this year, we took this opportunity to go back to those older episodes and redo the music and the sound effects and dialogue and narration and mixing and mastering. And plus, several of our guests have sent us updates that we've included at the end that can bring you up to speed on their particular stories on what God has been doing in the intervening years. And frankly, these stories sound a lot better now. We've remastered about 10 or so of these stories so far and are working on the rest, but we wanted to make sure you got to hear them. So starting next Tuesday, we'll be re-releasing these remastered episodes in your regular Compelled feed on the off weeks when we're not releasing a brand new Compelled testimony. So to be clear, we're not reducing the number of brand new Compelled stories that we're creating. That's still going to stay at about 20 a year. But if it's been 6 years since you heard one of our older stories, well, then right now is a great time to catch up on it one more time. Finally, let me just say this. We try to make every story on Compelled a labor of love. And that's why we spend upwards of 80 hours producing each testimony. The stories that God has written are worthy of celebration and lead us into worshiping Him further. But we are a small team, and we need your help. If you enjoy these testimonies and want to help us create more stories just like Tom's that celebrate what God is doing, then would you consider joining Compelled as a monthly partner or with a one-time donation? Just visit compelledpodcast.com/donate. Today's episode was edited by Will Jackson, mixing and mastering by Sonomorphic, and our associate producer is my beautiful wife, Sarah Hastings. I'm your host, Paul Hastings, and you've been listening to Compelled. We'll be back next time with another compelling story. We'll see you then.